Welcome back to Franchise Player, and today we're going to be checking out 5 Sega Dreamcast games that I think still hold up in 2025. Now, it's been a fun one going back to Sega Dreamcast games because this was a system that I did not grow up having. Matter of fact, I've never even played a legitimate Sega Dreamcast, so it's been really cool going back to this system via emulation and checking out some of these games, and it's pretty wild how well some of these still hold up. And without further ado, we're going to get right into this, and game number 1 here on the list is Cannon Spike, aka Gun Spike as it's known in Japan. Now, Cannon Spike is a game that I've heard of for years. One of the main reasons would be just due to how expensive this game is physically if you want it on a Dreamcast console, and another reason was this game was developed by Saikyo, and if you know anything about Saikyo, they made legendary shooters, legendary shoot 'em ups. So anything that's made by them, there's probably a good chance that that game is going to be pretty fun. Cannon Spike released on the Dreamcast back in November of 2000. So this game is pretty much a quarter century year old, which is insane when you put it that way. But even with that age, this game holds up incredibly well. This game is a fairly simple multi-directional shooter with arcade style gameplay. So it's fast-paced, it's great pick up and play action, and I think the graphics have held up pretty well too, considering it's, 25 years old. One thing that I think is pretty cool about Cannon Spike is even though there's only 7 playable characters, they really made them count. So there's a couple really cool Capcom characters in this game, just to name 2 of my favorites. One would be Cammy from Street Fighter, and then of course Mega Man. Now, could the roster have been a bit larger than 7 characters? Yeah, probably, but it's like, hey, any game that I can play as Mega Man in, I'm down and it's cool, right? And then of course seeing Cammy outside of Street Fighter is pretty interesting as well. So yeah, interesting batch that Capcom had on the roster. And a huge reason why I think this game stands the test of time is the simplicity, and the simplicity still shines in my opinion in terms of combat. So 3 different attacks. You have a melee attack, kind of your standard shot, and then you have a more powerful burst weapon as well. So yeah, I think just having 3 attacks really makes this game stay simple, and is part of the reason why I think it's still so fun. And that's something that I think Dreamcast games really nailed, is just good arcade action that translated from the arcades onto the home console. Now, one complaint I have about Cannon Spike, even though it's really, really fun and I highly recommend it, would be that I really wish the Dreamcast would have had a second analog stick, because this game would have been a perfect twin stick shooter. Mind you, that is not Cannon Spike's fault. They were just working with what they had with the Dreamcast controller. But if this game had a second analog stick, it would have been an amazing twin stick shooter. But even without that, the lock-on ability with one of the triggers and then using the face buttons to do your attacks is still fun and still enjoyable. But yeah, this game only got a 73 on Metacritic. Not really sure why. I think it deserves higher, especially for it being a pretty fun arcade game that actually I think, translated really well to the Dreamcast. Next up here, we have a banger, and that is Tokyo Extreme Racer, which came out on launch day here in the States, aka 9/9/1999. Awesome launch date. Tokyo Extreme Racer is awesome, man. This game holds up so well, and if I would have had access to this when I was a kid, I legit probably would have had a seizure just from access to all the amazing cars that are in this game. I mean, you have, God, the list goes on here. I'm stuttering like crazy because there's so many of them, but you have, GTRs, Integras, Supras. You have the Honda NSX, which is an incredible car. You have some Mitsubishis, some Subarus. Now, these aren't officially licensed, but obviously with the body of the car, you can obviously tell what it is. And like with the code name R32, wow, I wonder what that is. Obviously an R32 GTR. And the car selection was really, really good on this as well, especially, considering the time frame when this came out, not too long after the first Gran Turismo. So pretty robust selection of cars here. And like I said, I mean, if you're a JDM head, if you're really into that 90s JDM scene, this game is gonna do it for you. Now, enough of me ranting about all the amazing cars in this game. Let's jump right into the gameplay. And I will say, not only have the graphics held up well for the age, but I think the gameplay has held up fairly well too. The controls are still fairly tight. The gameplay is fairly unique in the sense that, like, when you go up to an opponent or a rival and want to race, you basically just flash your lights at them, and that basically shows them, hey, let's race, let's get after it. And the setting of this being at night in Tokyo on the highway, I really don't think it gets much better than this, man. Like, I think this is what every mid to late 90s JDM fan, I'd argue even early 2000s fan, would probably want at the time. I mean, if you're a fan of those cars even today, this game really just hits that bit of nostalgia. And luckily, with this being a Dreamcast list, this is an arcade style game. So this isn't a game you have to worry about sinking a ton of time into. You can pick it up, drop it, play whenever you want, and it's not like there's some intense story you have to follow like a lot of modern games today. So I'm a big fan of that. The races are fairly quick. I love the aesthetic in this game. I think the aesthetic in this is insanely cool. Like if you're a 90s kid, early 2000s kid, I think this game is, definitely going to get you right in the feels, just because, I don't know, there's something about it that I can't really explain, but the aesthetic is awesome. You get what I'm saying. And one last thing I wanted to say about this too, that kind of adds at least some depth and layer to the game, is that you are able to modify your cars. So there is an incentive to actually, play this game, modify your cars, make them better, look better, faster, that kind of thing. If you're looking for an arcade style racer from this era with these amazing cars, with this aesthetic, then look no further. Tokyo Extreme Racer is awesome. I definitely recommend it. And if you've played any of the other games in the series, let me know if those are good. I've yet to check out any of the others. So yeah, without further ado, let's jump into the next game on the list. And this would not be a Dreamcast list if I didn't have Soul Calibur on it. So Soul Calibur, another launch title, 99.99, and man, the Dreamcast had a stacked launch lineup. Definitely down to do a Dreamcast launch lineup video later on, but Soul Calibur, man, where do I even begin with the Soul Calibur series? So like I said earlier in the video, I did not grow up with the Dreamcast. I didn't know anybody who had one. Like none of my older cousins had one. Nobody in my neighborhood had one. So my first experience with Soul Calibur was actually Soul Calibur 2 on GameCube, the one where you could play as Link, which I thought was insanely cool as a kid. So Soul Calibur 1 I had always kind of looked at from afar and admired. I was like, that game looks incredible for its age, and it really kind of changed the fighting genre. I mean, obviously the Soul Calibur series is not what it used to be, but Soul Calibur in its prime was definitely nothing to play with. Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast was a pretty important release, one being a launch title, right? Having a strong launch lineup is always big, but Soul Calibur had originally came out on the arcade and was eventually ported to the Dreamcast and came out on launch day. So that might be like, okay, yeah, whatever. I mean, hey, the game was already out. No, this was a big deal because the Dreamcast version of Soul Calibur was actually much better than the arcade version. The Dreamcast version actually had better graphics than the arcade version, which was a big deal for the Dreamcast and Dreamcast owners, because this really showed that the Dreamcast could flex its muscle and not only play arcade games, but it could play them better than their arcade counterparts, which back in the late 90s was a huge deal. And Soul Calibur for the Dreamcast is actually one of the highest rated games ever on Metacritic. I don't know where exactly it lands, but I know it has a 98 on Metacritic, which is quite impressive. People, especially critics and reviewers, can be very tough on games. So a 98 on a fighting game, especially from this time frame, I think is definitely impressive. And I would highly recommend Soul Calibur if you want to try out kind of a more old school, I would say semi-early 3D fighter. Gameplay is simple enough, but has some depth. Graphics still look amazing. Mind you, I'm using an emulator here, so it might look even better if you have a CRT setup. I think this would look pretty legit on a CRT. Would love to find one of those these days, but they're getting harder and harder to find, and the ones in good condition are pricey, but that's another story for another day. But yeah, good selection of game modes, good selection of characters. This game really blew me away with how well it's held up. I mean, over 25 years at this point, which is still crazy even saying that. But yeah, if it's been a while since you've played Soul Calibur, then pop it in, give it a shot, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. Next up here is a game that I don't think gets enough love in the retro sports game department, and that is NBA Showtime NBA on NBC. And this game graphically, I don't think really holds up that well unless you just love that aesthetic from this era, but the part of this game that really holds up is the gameplay. And this game was developed and published by Midway, and if you were a fan of arcadey sports games, I'd say from the mid to late 90s to early 2000s, then Midway had you in good hands. From the NFL Blitz series to MLB Slugfest, which Slugfest is super underrated, Red Card Soccer 2003, and then the NHL Hits games. So Midway was a straight up pro at making these arcade style sports games. And NBA Showtime, NBA on NBC is no different in that way. If you were a fan of NBA Hang Time or NBA Jam, this was basically a follow-up to those games where they kept pretty much that same arcadey style basketball action. And like I said, graphically, this game does not look good like most older sports games, but the gameplay is super fun. It's great 2-on-2 action. Pick the 2 players you want to roll with. And this first game here, I went with Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady from the Toronto Raptors. So the players from this era, the teams from this era are really nostalgic. It's like a bunch of players that I grew up with and loved, and a ton of legends. So, it's really cool in that way. And then the gameplay is just fast-paced, fun action. Now, I may have not had a Dreamcast growing up, but I did have this game growing up, and I had it on PS1. And this is probably one of like my earliest video game memories, is playing this game. I remember it was my dad's PS1. We had this game and I used to play it with him all the time. And I credit this game really with like getting me into basketball, specifically the NBA. Mind you, I was really young, so it's not like I really knew who a whole lot of the players or teams were, but I remember just having a great time on this game. And yeah, really got me into basketball. Really got me into like arcade sports games, probably why I ended up loving, NFL Street and Slugfest so much the older I got. But this is a great game, great arcade sports game. Can't recommend it enough. If you're a fan of this era of NBA specifically, it might be even worth jumping on just to check out the old rosters with legends like, Allen Iverson, Kevin Garnett, Tracy McGrady, Penny Hardaway, Jason Kidd, guys like that. So yeah, dope era of basketball. Fun game, and if you can get it for cheap or have an emulator at your disposal, I think it's worth popping in for a couple minutes and killing some time on a weekend. And last but not least, coming up here, we have another Psikyo shooter, and that is Gunbird 2. And Gunbird 2 was released on the Dreamcast here in North America on November 15th of 2000, and with this being developed by Psikyo and published by Capcom, you already know this is a quality game. Now, if you want this game physically, Gunbird 1 and Gunbird 2 are definitely not cheap on the Dreamcast. So if you're wanting to, own this physically in some kind of capacity, I highly recommend checking out some of the Psikyo shooting library collections. I have one of them on Switch, and that's actually how I first started playing Gunbird 1 and 2. And I think 2 holds up really well, so does the first one, but today we're talking about the second one. And, with this being a shmup, it being a shoot 'em up, however you want to call it, right, there's loads and loads of replayability. And along with that replayability, I think the graphical style of this game has held up incredibly well. The colors, the character art, the character design, the soundtrack, not too bad either. So I think overall, this is a pretty good package for a game of its age, especially if you like arcade shooters. And if you end up playing Gunbird 2 and having a great time and you're kind of itching for more shoot 'em up goodness, the Dreamcast is actually filled with tons and tons of shoot 'em ups. I think it's definitely one of the consoles out there that has the most shmups for it. I know the Saturn has its fair share as well, but the Dreamcast definitely holds its own. But yeah, like I mentioned earlier, if you're dying to have this game physically, be prepared to whip the credit card out, because this game looks like it's going for like 120 or 130 complete on eBay. So there's other options out there. Emulate it. Check out those Psikyo shooting collections or shooting libraries if you want to play it on some other systems. And yeah, I can't recommend Gunbird 2 enough. If you like this or like the way it looks, maybe start with the first one, and it's going to be a very similar gameplay experience for you. But yeah, guys, that'll pretty much do it for today's video. I think these Dreamcast games all hold up pretty well, especially considering their age. And if there's any Dreamcast games that you think hold up well, or any that you think are worth trying out, drop them in the comments. I'm always down to check out new games, and I'll definitely have some more episodes of this series later on of exploring games that I think hold up well for other consoles. Maybe I'll do the GameCube, some PS1, some PS2, maybe some Vita again. And yeah, let me know what games you recommend. As usual, appreciate you guys for watching, and we'll catch you soon with another video.